Hello and welcome, dear listener. Tonight, as you gently settle in, we begin our voyage into the ancient world of myths, magic, gods, and heroes. Let this first tale be the gateway to many more, a soft, intriguing entry into a universe built on wonder and cosmic drama. Our opening story is none other than the myth of how the world itself was born, the Greek tale of creation. In the beginning, and by that, we mean a time, before clocks, calendars, or even memory. There was absolutely nothing. No sky, no sun, no land, no sea. Not even silence. Just a vast, formless void called chaos. Chaos wasn't evil or malevolent. It simply was. The absence of all things. No rules, no matter, no meaning. Then, in a moment outside of time, existence stirred. Out of chaos, from that infinite formlessness, came the first primordial forces. Beings that weren't quite gods, as we understand them, but cosmic concepts given form. They were the building blocks of the universe. Gaia, the earth, solid and nurturing. Tartarus, the deepest abyss beneath the world. Nyx, the shrouded night. Erebus, darkness personified. And radiant Eros, the force of desire and union. These weren't born in the way living creatures are. They manifested, inevitable and eternal. Gaia, the earth, became the fertile foundation of all life. And without a mate, she bore Uranus, the sky, her perfect complement, who stretched above her and encircled the horizon. From their sacred and divine union, the Titans were born. 12 in total, 6 daughters and 6 sons, each brimming with power, mystery, and the ability to shape the cosmos. But Gaia did not stop creating. More children came, creatures far stranger and more fearsome. There were the Cyclopes, with a single fiery eye in the middle of their foreheads, master builders of thunder and lightning. Then came the Hecatoncheires, monstrous giants with 100 arms and 50 heads, overwhelming and terrifying to behold. Uranus, dismayed by these powerful and grotesque offspring, feared their strength. He condemned them, casting them into the depths of Tartarus, sealing them in the gloom of the abyss. Gaia, heartbroken and enraged at this cruelty toward her children, vowed revenge. She forged a sickle of flint and offered it to her youngest Titan son, Cronus. Clever, ambitious, and ruthless, she whispered her plan, and Cronus agreed. One fateful night, as Uranus descended to lie with Gaia, Cronus leapt from the shadows and with the sickle castrated his father. From Uranus's blood more beings emerged, the Furies, spirits of vengeance, the giants, and from the sea foam touched by his essence, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. With Uranus overthrown, Cronus took the throne of the cosmos. He ruled beside his sister and queen Rhea, and for a time, peace reigned. But the prophecy that had haunted his father now haunted him, that he too would be overthrown by his child. Fear ruled Cronus's heart. Each time Rhea bore him a child, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, he swallowed them whole, ensuring they could never rise against him. Rhea, grief-stricken, refused to lose another child. When she gave birth to her 6th, Zeus, she devised a cunning ruse. She wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and gave it to Cronus. He devoured it without suspicion, while the real infant Zeus was spirited away to a secret cave on the island of Crete, raised by nymphs and suckled by a divine goat. Years passed, and Zeus grew strong, clever, and brave. When he came of age, he returned to confront his father. With the help of the goddess Metis, he crafted a potion that caused Cronus to vomit up the siblings he had consumed. Fully grown and enraged, they emerged into the world. United at last, they declared war on the old order. The battle between the Titans and the children of Cronus, now known as the Olympians, shook the very foundations of the world. For 10 years, the skies thundered and the earth trembled. In the end, Zeus freed the Cyclopes from Tartarus, and in gratitude, they gifted him thunder and lightning as weapons. With these, and the combined might of his siblings, Zeus struck down Cronus and the Titans. They were cast into Tartarus, bound in chains, guarded by monstrous beings for all eternity. The age of the Titans had ended, and the age of the Olympians had begun. But peace never lasts long in the world of gods. A new prophecy surfaced. That Zeus, like his father and grandfather before him, would be overthrown by his own son. Determined to break the cycle, he swallowed his pregnant first wife, Metis, hoping to trap the child inside him forever. Yet destiny has ways of unfolding, regardless of divine plans. One day, Zeus was struck by an immense headache. To relieve his agony, the god Hephaestus cleaved his head open, and out sprang Athena, fully grown, armored and radiant with wisdom and warlike grace. Despite her dramatic entrance, Athena was embraced by the Olympians and took her place among the gods. One by one, the pantheon expanded. Some were born of divine unions, others from the sea, the earth, or even raw chaos itself. Aphrodite, Ares, Apollo, Artemis. Each god and goddess embodied an essential force of nature, emotion, or human experience. The gods settled atop Mount Olympus, a place high above mortal reach, wrapped in clouds and brilliance. From there, they ruled over the world, sometimes benevolently, sometimes with cruelty, often with whimsy. Their feasts were eternal, their arguments fierce, and their intrigues never-ending. And so came the first great era, the Age of the Gods, where divine beings shaped the fate of the world. But this age, too, would pass. In time, humans were born, frail, curious, short-lived. The gods walked among them, sometimes helping, sometimes hindering, sometimes loving them. From such unions, demigods were born, heroes with the strength of immortals and the souls of men. They would go on to perform great deeds, face impossible odds, and become legends whispered across the ages. Some gods shared secrets with mankind. Prometheus, bold and compassionate, stole fire from the heavens and gifted it to humans, an act that changed the world forever, and for which he paid a terrible price. Demeter taught agriculture, Dionysus gifted wine and madness. But over time, the gods withdrew from the mortal realm, tired of human frailty, disillusioned by their own interference. The Age of Gods and Mortals slowly came to a close, giving rise to a new epoch, the Heroic Age. This was a time of epic quests and fierce battles, where men with godly blood did the impossible and etched their names into history. Perseus, who slew Medusa; Theseus, who braved the labyrinth; Heracles, burdened with his mighty labors; Jason, who sailed for the Golden Fleece; Achilles and Hector, doomed champions of war. Their stories, glorious and tragic, were remembered not just for their feats, but for their humanity. These heroes were not perfect. They were proud, vengeful, impulsive, tender, and often deeply flawed. But it was their struggles, their growth, pain, and triumph that made them enduring. Tonight, we walk alongside them. We'll witness the rise of Heracles, the fury of Achilles, the cunning of Odysseus. We'll sail through time and myth, pausing between tales to reflect on the roots of Greek mythology, how it shaped an entire civilization and echoed through the ages into the very stories we tell today. If you fall asleep as the tale unfolds, worry not. You can return anytime, guided by the timestamps in the comments. Let your eyes close, your body relax, and your imagination awaken. You can also find these stories on Spotify, Apple Music, and Patreon. There you can listen offline, support the channel, and enjoy weekly updates and exclusive content. Now, let's begin. The Legend of Heracles, a hero born of God and mortal, destined to face 12 impossible labors, to redeem a terrible mistake and etch his name into eternity. Let us now delve deeper into the tale of Heracles, one of the greatest heroes to ever walk the earth, a figure whose strength was matched only by the weight of his suffering. His story begins with Zeus, king of the gods, whose appetite for mortal women was boundless, and whose romantic escapades often caused storms across both heaven and earth. Among Zeus's many liaisons, there was one that would mark the beginning of Heracles' long, arduous journey. The mortal woman was Alcmene, a noble and radiant beauty whose lineage traced back to Perseus, a great hero in his own right. Her grace and wisdom were said to rival those of the goddesses. her face so serene that even Aphrodite would pause in admiration. Alcmene was married to Amphitryon, a Theban general. One day, as Amphitryon departed for war, Zeus seized the opportunity, cloaking himself in the likeness of her husband and extending the length of a single night to 3. With his divine will, he deceived Alcmene and lay with her. That very same night, the real Amphitryon returned, and unaware of what had transpired, also shared her bed. Thus, Alcmene became pregnant with twins, one child of mortal blood, the other a son of Zeus. But not all divine affairs passed unnoticed. Hera, wife of Zeus and goddess of queenship and vengeance, discovered her husband's betrayal. Her jealousy ignited into fury, and she vowed to punish the child before he even saw the light of day. To exact her revenge, Hera tricked Zeus into swearing a fateful oath, that the next male descendant born of Perseus's line would become the High King of Mycenae. Zeus, confident it would be his own son, proudly agreed. But Hera, ever cunning, intervened. She delayed Alcmene's labor and induced premature birth in Eurystheus, a distant relative. As a result, Eurystheus became king, and not the son of Zeus. When Heracles, the true son of Zeus, was finally born, Hera's wrath was far from over. Out of fear for her child's safety, Alcmene abandoned the infant in a field. But the child did not remain alone for long. The goddess Athena, often a protector of heroes, guided the baby to Hera herself, who, not recognizing the boy and moved by a brief maternal instinct, took him to her breast. Heracles suckled with such vigor that Hera cried out in pain, pushing the child away. From her spilled milk, the stars were streaked with white, creating what mortals now call the Milky Way. Realizing what had happened, Hera cast the child away, and Athena returned him to his mother, who chose to raise him in secret with Amphitryon. From his earliest days, Heracles displayed strength and courage far beyond any child. One night, Hera sent 2 serpents to his cradle to kill him, but the infant hero awoke, grabbed the snakes with his bare hands, and strangled them. When his caretakers rushed in, they found him laughing, playing with the lifeless creatures as though they were toys. Despite his innocence, Heracles would never be free from Hera's hatred. Hoping to deflect her wrath, Amphitryon renamed the boy Heracles, which meant glory of Hera. A cruel irony meant to appease the goddess, but names held little power over divine grudges. As Heracles grew into manhood, his stature and strength became legendary. He was trained by the wisest of mentors in archery, music, philosophy, and wrestling. In time, he married Megara, the daughter of the king of Thebes, and together they had 3 children. For a brief period, Heracles knew joy, peace, and love. But Hera would not allow happiness to endure. She struck Heracles with a divine madness, a wild, uncontrollable rage that clouded his mind and erased reason. In this state, he did the unthinkable. Believing his family to be enemies, he slaughtered them all, wife and children alike, with his own hands. When he awoke from his madness and saw what he had done, Heracles was overcome with horror and grief. He fled Thebes and wandered the lands, searching for redemption, weighed down by guilt heavier than any weapon he had ever lifted. Seeking penance, he arrived at the Oracle of Delphi, the sacred sanctuary of Apollo, where the priestess Pythia spoke the god's words. But Hera, still not done with him, whispered into the priestess's mind. The oracle instructed Heracles to serve King Eurystheus, the very man who had unjustly taken the throne, for 10 years. Only by performing whatever tasks the king demanded could Heracles be cleansed of his sin. And so, Heracles submitted himself to the will of another, beginning what would become the most famous saga of his life, the 12 Labors. King Eurystheus, spurred by Hera's influence, sought to break the hero. For Heracles' first labor, he was sent to Nemea, a region terrorized by a monstrous lion. This was no ordinary beast. The Nemean lion had golden fur that no blade could pierce and claws sharp enough to tear through armor like parchment. Unaware of the creature's invulnerability, Heracles initially tried to slay the lion with arrows, but the missiles bounced harmlessly off its hide. He then pursued the lion to its lair, a dark cave with 2 entrances. Using cunning as well as strength, he blocked one exit, forcing the lion into a single escape path. Inside the cave, armed only with a wooden club and his bare hands, Heracles faced the beast. After a fierce struggle, he strangled the lion to death, crushing its windpipe in his powerful grip. But even in death, the lion's magical hide resisted all tools. Heracles could not skin it. Seeing his struggle, the goddess Athena appeared and advised him to use one of the lion's own claws to cut through the enchanted pelt. It worked. Heracles fashioned the hide into a cloak, draping it over his shoulders. From that moment on, it became his trademark, a symbol of resilience and protection. He returned to Mycenae, with the lion's carcass slung over his shoulders. King Eurystheus was so terrified by the sight of the dead monster that he hid inside a large storage jar and refused to come out. From then on, all further instructions were delivered to Heracles by a herald, as the king could no longer bear to speak to him directly. But if Eurystheus had hoped this first trial would defeat Heracles, he was sorely mistaken. Instead, it only proved the hero's immense strength, ingenuity, and composure under pressure. It was clear that brute force alone was not the source of his success. Heracles also possessed intelligence, courage, and an uncanny ability to turn adversity into victory. In Greek culture, these qualities were what defined a true hero, but not in the way we often think of heroes today. The word hero in ancient times didn't simply mean a person who performed good deeds. It described a figure who stood between gods and mortals, often of mixed divine and human blood, capable of extraordinary feats, yet deeply flawed and emotionally human. Heracles embodied these contradictions. He was a being of immense strength, yet emotionally fragile. He could be noble, kind, and protective, but also impulsive, wrathful, and easily manipulated. Like many Greek heroes, his greatness came not from perfection, but from struggle, from the journey of overcoming both external monsters and internal demons. Greek heroes differed from gods in one crucial way: they changed, while gods remained fixed, embodying eternal aspects like war, wisdom, or love. Heroes grew. They suffered. They learned. Their stories were journeys, filled with trials that shaped them and transformed them. Among these figures, Heracles stood tall, not just for the magnitude of his labors, but for the depth of his humanity. His tale reminds us that greatness is not the absence of failure, but the will to rise again, no matter how far one has fallen. And so, with the lion vanquished and his first task behind him, Heracles prepared to face his next labor, a challenge crafted with even more cruelty and cunning by the ever-vengeful Hera and her pawn, King Eurystheus. But that, dear listener, is a story for the next chapter of our journey. With the first of his labors behind him, Heracles stood at the threshold of a long and perilous road. His triumph over the Nemean lion had shaken King Eurystheus, but far from relenting, the king, with Hera's whispering counsel ever at his ear, devised an even more sinister trial. The next labor would pit Heracles against a beast yet more terrifying and more deadly, a creature not only monstrous in form, but seemingly immortal in function. This was the Lernaean Hydra. The Hydra dwelled in the marshes near Lake Lerna, a place long feared by mortals. It was said to be a gateway to the underworld itself, a festering mist-shrouded swamp where the dead could rise and the living could disappear. The Hydra that lived there was no simple serpent. It was a monstrous, slithering beast with multiple heads. Some accounts said 7, others 9, and still others claimed it had 100. But one detail was always consistent. When one head was severed, 2 would grow back in its place. Its blood and breath were so venomous that they could wither grass, blacken trees, and kill with a single touch. The mere stench of its presence was said to drive animals mad, or make birds fall from the sky. No mortal had ever approached it and lived. Yet Heracles, undeterred, made his way to Lerna. As he neared the swamp, he wrapped a cloth tightly around his mouth and nose to protect himself from the toxic fumes. He tracked the Hydra to its lair, a murky cave beside the water. To lure it out, he fired flaming arrows into the darkness, lighting the entrance and sending smoke billowing through the tunnel. The Hydra emerged, hissing furiously, its heads writhing and snapping like a nest of vipers, each mouth eager to tear flesh. The battle began in earnest. Heracles swung his sword with unmatched force, decapitating heads one after another. But as soon as they fell, more would sprout in their place. The beast seemed to grow stronger with every strike. He was not fighting a creature. He was fighting multiplication itself. Realizing brute force would not win the day, Heracles called for aid. His nephew, Iolaus, a young but clever companion, came to his side. Inspired by a sudden insight, Iolaus lit a torch and used its flame to cauterize each stump immediately after Heracles severed a head. With the wound sealed by fire, the Hydra could no longer regenerate. Slowly the tide turned. Heads fell and were not replaced. The great monster screamed with rage, its movements slowing as its strength waned. Only one head remained, the central one, ancient and immortal, immune even to fire. At that moment, Athena appeared again, offering Heracles a golden sword forged by Hephaestus himself. With this divine blade, Heracles sliced off the final unkillable head. He buried it beneath a massive boulder to ensure it could never rise again. But he wasn't done. Knowing the Hydra's blood was laced with deadly poison, he dipped his arrows into it. These arrows would become legendary, carrying certain death for whoever they touched. They were tools of war, yes, but also symbols of a hard-earned victory and the terrible price of divine trials. When Heracles returned to Eurystheus to report his success, the king listened with tight lips and narrowed eyes. Hera had warned him that Heracles might succeed again, and so Eurystheus, reaching for any excuse, declared the labor invalid. Because Heracles had accepted help, however small, from Iolaus, the labor would not count. And so the tally stood unchanged. Heracles had completed 2 tasks, but only one was recognized. This would become a pattern in his journey. Victories tarnished by pettiness, conditions changed retroactively, accomplishments discredited through the twisting of rules. Hera would accept nothing less than his ruin. For the third labor, Eurystheus crafted a new kind of trap. No monsters, no battles, just a chase. He ordered Heracles to capture the Ceryneian hind, a sacred animal blessed by Artemis herself, goddess of the hunt and wilderness. The hind was no ordinary deer, with gleaming golden antlers and hooves of bronze. It was swift beyond imagination, said to outrun even arrows in flight. It was also untouchable. To harm or capture it risked the wrath of Artemis, one of the most venerated and feared Olympians. This was a dilemma designed to destroy Heracles, whether he succeeded or failed. If he failed, he would face shame. If he succeeded, he would offend a goddess. Still, Heracles accepted the task. He set out across Greece following whispers of sightings, hoofprints barely pressed into soft earth, and trails through dewy meadows. The chase became a journey of months, then nearly a year. He crossed mountains, valleys, and rivers, always a step behind the elusive creature. One morning in the highlands of Hyperborea, where the cold wind sang through the trees, Heracles saw the golden glint of antlers in the distance. The hind paused for just a moment, distracted, and Heracles acted. He loosed a net and brought it down, not harming the animal, only capturing it gently. As he made his way back to Mycenae, he was confronted by Artemis herself, radiant and dangerous. She demanded the return of her sacred beast. Heracles bowed in respect and explained his predicament. He did not hunt the hind out of disrespect, but out of obligation, seeking redemption for crimes he would never forgive himself for. He promised to release the animal unharmed the moment he had presented it to the king. Artemis, whose wrath could fell cities, looked upon him and saw not defiance, but sorrow. She relented with a stern warning. Any future offense would not be forgiven so lightly. Heracles brought the hind to Eurystheus, but once again, deceit clouded the event. The king tried to claim the creature for his private collection, but Heracles, having sworn a promise to the goddess, asked Eurystheus to take it directly from his hands. As the king reached out, Heracles released the hind, and it darted away in a blur of gold and bronze, returning to Artemis's forest. The third labor was complete, and Eurystheus had been outwitted once more. But Hera was learning. Heracles, they realized, could not simply be overwhelmed by monsters or hunted into failure. He was resourceful, persistent, and above all, clever. So for the fourth labor, they would force him into a land of chaos, a place far from civilization, full of wild beasts and wilder inhabitants. They sent him to Mount Erymanthos, deep within Arcadia, a remote, forested land said to be home to man-eating beasts and ancient secrets. His task, to capture the Erymanthian boar, a creature of enormous size and boundless fury. It roamed the mountainsides, tearing through fields, destroying crops, and terrifying villagers with its tusks sharp as daggers. Heracles began his trek into the mountains, but along the way, he stopped to visit an old friend, a centaur named Pholus. Unlike many of his kind, Pholus was wise, kind, and hospitable. The two shared stories and food, and Heracles asked for wine. Pholus hesitated. The jar he possessed was sacred, a gift from Dionysus himself. Potent, divine, and dangerous. But Heracles insisted. As soon as the jar was opened, its scent drifted through the mountain air. Other centaurs, drawn by the aroma, arrived in a frenzy. Unlike Pholus, most centaurs were wild, untamed beings, part man, part beast. Their minds were ruled by impulse and desire, and the wine drove them into madness. They attacked. Heracles fought them off, his poisoned arrows striking with lethal precision. Many fell or fled in terror. After the battle, he sought wisdom from Chiron, the oldest and wisest of all centaurs. Immortal, noble, and a teacher to gods and heroes alike. Chiron advised Heracles to drive the boar into the snow, to force it into deep drifts where its strength would be useless, its speed slowed. Following this advice, Heracles lured the boar up the slopes of the mountain. When the snow deepened, the creature faltered, and Heracles pounced. He wrestled it into submission and bound it with chains. Slung across his shoulders, the beast was taken back to Mycenae. Once more, Eurystheus cowered in fear. He had a massive jar, half buried in the earth, and when Heracles appeared, he dived into it again, refusing to come out until the creature was gone. Heracles had now completed 4 tasks. Each had tested a different facet of his character: strength, ingenuity, endurance, and restraint. And with each success, he grew not only in fame, but in understanding of himself, the gods, and the world he was shaping with every step. And yet the path ahead was long. Hera and Eurystheus would never relent. Each labor would stretch him further, break him down, and call upon not just his muscle, but his mind and spirit. The trials had only begun. Following his triumph over the Erymanthian boar, Heracles returned to Mycenae once again, only to find that King Eurystheus had been waiting with another demeaning challenge. This time, the task was not about ferocity or fear. It was about filth. The 5th labor seemed at first glance to be beneath a man of Heracles' stature. It was not about slaying monsters or capturing sacred beasts, but cleaning. Specifically, the stables of King Augeas of Elis. These were no ordinary stables, however. Augeas owned the largest herds of cattle in all of Greece, beasts gifted by the gods themselves and blessed with immortality. Because they never aged or died, they also never ceased producing waste, an unimaginable amount of it. For decades, the stables had gone untouched, their filth piling high, creating a stench that could drive men to tears from miles away. Eurystheus didn't choose this task to humble Heracles alone. He chose it to humiliate him, to force the mighty slayer of lions and hydras into the role of a stable boy. The implication was clear: brute strength was no use here. This was a job of filth, disgust, and despair. No heroism, no glory, just muck. But Heracles, ever adaptable, accepted the challenge. He journeyed to Elis and presented himself before Augeas. Rather than demand the king's cooperation, he made a bold offer. If he could clean the stables in a single day, Augeas would reward him with 1/10 of his cattle. Amused and convinced of the task's impossibility, Augeas agreed. He was certain Heracles would fail and would become a laughingstock across Greece. But Heracles had no intention of tackling the task with shovel and pail. Instead, he looked to nature for a solution. Observing that two mighty rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, flowed near the palace, Heracles conceived a daring plan. Using his immense strength and skill in engineering, he broke down sections of the stable walls and dug deep channels to redirect the rivers. The waters surged through the filthy halls with thunderous force, washing away years, perhaps centuries, of accumulated filth in a matter of hours. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the stables sparkled with cleanliness, and the stench had been carried away downstream. When Heracles returned to claim his reward, Augeas balked. He accused Heracles of trickery, saying that it was the rivers, not the hero, who had done the work. Worse still, he refused to honor their agreement. Heracles, enraged by the betrayal, later returned to Elis with an army and punished Augeas, installing his loyal son Phyleus as the rightful king. Back in Mycenae, Eurystheus refused to count the labor. He declared that since Heracles had accepted payment, or was intended to, and had used the aid of natural forces, the task was void. So again, the tally of official labors remained stuck. Heracles had now completed 5, but only 3 were acknowledged. Despite the injustice, Heracles pressed on. The 6th labor would take him to the swamps of Stymphalia in Arcadia, a region plagued by a different kind of horror. Here, a flock of deadly birds had taken residence, corrupting the skies and poisoning the land below. The Stymphalian birds were not natural creatures. Their feathers were forged of sharp bronze, their beaks as strong as iron, and they flew in dense, coordinated swarms like a living storm. When disturbed, they could launch their metallic feathers with lethal force, cutting down men and animals alike. They had defiled the land, ravaged crops, and driven entire villages into ruin. Their droppings were toxic, corroding soil and polluting streams. Even approaching their nesting grounds was nearly impossible. The marshes were treacherous, and the soft, waterlogged ground could not support a man's weight. But Heracles, as always, pushed forward. Stymied by the impassable terrain and under constant threat of attack, Heracles turned once again to the gods for aid. Athena, ever his silent supporter, came to his side. She gifted him a crotala, a pair of bronze rattles forged by Hephaestus, the god of blacksmiths. These instruments, when shaken, produced a sound so loud and jarring that it echoed through the mountains like thunder. Climbing to a ridge above the marsh, Heracles shook the crotala with all his might. The sound shattered the silence of the swamp. The birds, terrified, burst from the trees in panicked flight. As they circled above, Heracles unleashed a volley of his poisoned arrows. The very same dipped in the Hydra's blood. Dozens of birds fell from the sky, and the rest fled, never to return. With a handful of their metallic corpses in hand as proof, Heracles returned to Eurystheus. The king, though displeased, had no choice but to count this labor. 6 now stood completed, 4 officially recognized. But Eurystheus, prompted by Hera, was not ready to admit defeat. For the 7th labor, he sent Heracles across the sea to the island of Crete to capture the Cretan bull, a beast as majestic as it was dangerous. Years earlier, King Minos of Crete had promised to sacrifice whatever animal Poseidon sent from the sea as a sign of divine favor. In response, Poseidon had sent a magnificent white bull, massive and gleaming, a creature so perfect that Minos could not bear to part with it. Instead of sacrificing the divine bull, he secretly swapped it with an ordinary one and kept the heavenly creature for his own herds. But gods do not take betrayal lightly. Poseidon, furious at Minos's deceit, cursed the bull, turning its nature savage and untamable. The creature rampaged across the island, tearing down trees, trampling fields, and causing destruction wherever it ran. More than that, Poseidon's vengeance reached beyond the bull. He called upon Aphrodite, goddess of love and desire, who cast a terrible spell upon Minos's wife, Pasiphae. Overcome by an unnatural obsession, she fell in love with the bull. From this grotesque union, a half-man, half-bull creature was born. The Minotaur. While the Minotaur was locked away in the labyrinth built by Daedalus, the original bull, still wild, still cursed, remained loose on the island. This was the creature Heracles was sent to capture. Arriving in Crete, Heracles confronted the bull directly, wrestling it into submission with nothing but his hands. Though it fought fiercely, goring trees and stomping holes in the earth, Heracles eventually overpowered it and bound it in ropes. He sailed back to Mycenae with the beast in tow. As usual, Eurystheus was too frightened to keep it. He released the bull, which later wandered to Marathon in Attica, becoming another future trial for another hero, Theseus. Now 7 labors stood complete. Each trial was expanding the scope of Heracles' journey across mainland Greece, deep into wilderness, and now across the sea. And as the tale continued, the labors would reach even further, across vast deserts, into foreign kingdoms, and eventually to the very gates of the underworld. But before such dark journeys, the 8th labor took Heracles to Thrace, a wild and violent land to the northeast. His target, the mares of Diomedes. These were no ordinary horses. They were carnivorous, savage, and fed on human flesh. They were owned by Diomedes, king of Thrace and son of Ares, the god of war. Diomedes delighted in feeding his enemies, prisoners, and even guests to his man-eating beasts. In his warped sense of justice, hospitality was a trap, and those who accepted it paid with their lives. Heracles set out for Thrace, accompanied by a band of trusted followers. When they reached the kingdom, he stole the mares under the cover of night. But Diomedes soon gave chase with his army. A fierce battle erupted. Heracles fought valiantly and slew the war-hardened king, overpowering him with an axe. Then, as a cruel but fitting twist, he fed Diomedes' corpse to the very beasts the king had used to devour others. Something strange happened then. Once the mares had eaten their master, their madness subsided. They grew calm, even docile. Heracles seized the opportunity, muzzled them, and led them back to Eurystheus. Again the king recoiled in fear. He dedicated the horses to Hera and refused to keep them. With 8 trials now behind him, Heracles had journeyed across kingdoms, faced monsters and men, endured mockery and manipulation, and yet his strength had not waned. It had deepened. So too had his understanding of justice, vengeance, and the strange morality of gods and mortals. But his trials were not done. Ahead lay even greater challenges, not just of muscle and might, but of cunning endurance and spiritual resolve. And so our tale marches. 8 labors behind him, Heracles had already faced terrors that would have broken lesser men. Yet Eurystheus, ever under Hera's jealous eye, remained unsatisfied. He desired to test not just Heracles' strength, but the very limits of his endurance and cunning. The next task would take the hero to the distant lands of the warrior women, the Amazons. The 9th labor, to retrieve the belt of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. This was no ordinary accessory. The belt, a gift from her father, Ares, god of war, was a symbol of authority, a mark of honor, and a magical item that granted her unmatched strength and command. Eurystheus did not want the belt for any strategic purpose. Instead, he promised it to his daughter. A childish request with lethal consequences. But such were the whims of kings and queens alike. The Amazons were a fierce and isolated tribe of warrior women, said to dwell along the shores of the Black Sea. They lived without men, raised only female children, and devoted their lives to warfare, horsemanship, and freedom. To the Greeks, they were exotic, dangerous and mysterious, both feared and fantasized. Heracles would need a crew, for the journey would be long and uncertain. He assembled a group of loyal companions and set sail across the Aegean, skimming the sunlit waves and pushing eastward into darker, stranger waters. The voyage was riddled with peril. Rough seas, unfamiliar harbors, and tales of hostile lands. But after weeks at sea, they finally reached the territory of the Amazons. To Heracles' surprise, Queen Hippolyta did not meet him with hostility. News of his exploits had reached even this remote land, and the Amazons, though wary of men, respected strength and valor. Hippolyta, impressed by his honesty and humility, agreed to give him the belt willingly. Peace, it seemed, would win the day. But Hera could not allow such a resolution. Descending from Olympus in disguise, the goddess spread a rumor among the Amazons that Heracles had come not to negotiate, but to kidnap their queen. Panic spread like wildfire. The warrior women, fueled by fury and fear, donned their armor and mounted their horses. From the edge of the camp, a war cry echoed. As the Amazon army charged, Heracles misunderstood. Believing Hippolyta had betrayed him, he reacted with the instinct of a soldier. In the chaos, he fought his way through the Amazon ranks and killed the queen, claiming the belt by force. The battle ended with sorrow. Heracles had not desired bloodshed, but Hera had sown discord, and the hero, deceived by a god's malice, bore the cost. He and his men sailed home, belt in hand, but hearts heavy. Eurystheus was pleased. The belt was delivered to his daughter, and Heracles, stained by needless death, was sent on to his next mission. And this time, he would journey further than ever before, to the edge of the known world, where the sun dipped into the sea. The 10th labor, to steal the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was no ordinary man. He was a giant with 3 bodies fused at the waist, 3 heads atop muscular necks, and 6 arms that wielded weapons of immense size. He ruled an island called Erythea, located far to the west near the ends of the earth, beyond the scorching deserts of Libya, where the sky met the ocean. The task was not just to defeat Geryon, but to bring back his prized herd. A breed of magnificent red cattle, watched over by a fearsome 2-headed dog named Orthrus, and a herdsman as brutal as his master. Heracles journeyed westward for months, traversing the Libyan desert beneath the blistering sun. The heat was relentless, the sand endless. At one point, in a moment of rage and frustration, Heracles drew his bow and fired an arrow at the sun itself. Astonished by the hero's boldness, Helios, the sun god, did not punish him. Instead, he admired his courage and offered him a gift, a golden cup in which the sun sailed each night across the ocean to rise again in the east. Using this divine vessel, Heracles crossed the sea and reached Erythea in a single night. But even with such aid, the task ahead was formidable. First came Orthrus, the 2-headed dog, a savage creature trained to kill. Heracles struck it down with a single blow from his club. Next was the herdsman, who rushed forward in a fury. He too fell swiftly. But the commotion alerted Geryon. The 3-bodied giant appeared, a towering monstrosity clad in bronze, armed with 3 shields and 3 spears. His voices echoed in unison, each tone more terrifying than the last. The ground shook as he advanced, but Heracles was ready. He raised his bow and loosed a single arrow, dipped in Hydra's venom. The shaft flew fast and true, piercing Geryon's side and burying itself in one of his hearts. The poison spread rapidly, and with a roar that trembled the heavens, the giant fell. Heracles gathered the cattle and loaded them into the golden cup. He sailed back across the ocean, but his trials were not over. Hera, ever vengeful, sent a gadfly to torment the herd. The maddened cattle scattered across the countryside, and Heracles spent months retrieving them one by one. As if that weren't enough, Hera summoned floods to wash away the roads, forcing Heracles to build stone causeways with his bare hands. When he finally returned to Mycenae, exhausted and sunburned, Eurystheus received the cattle and sacrificed them to Hera. Not in gratitude, but in mockery. And still, 2 labors remained. By now, Hera and Eurystheus were growing desperate. No monster had been too fierce, no land too distant, no trap too cunning. The next labor would be designed not just to challenge Heracles, but to bewilder him, to send him on a journey so vague and unreachable that he might never return. The 11th labor, to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides. These apples were no ordinary fruit. They grew in a hidden garden at the edge of the world, beyond the western sea, where the daughters of Atlas, the Hesperides, guarded them. The garden had been a wedding gift to Hera from Gaia, and the apples glowed with divine light. Some said they granted immortality, others believed they symbolized knowledge and divine favor. But the apples were not merely protected by the nymphs. A great dragon named Ladon coiled around the tree's base, never slept, and never blinked. Its scales shimmered like polished obsidian, and its breath smelled of sulfur and smoke. No one knew the exact location of the garden. So Heracles wandered the earth, seeking answers from seers, gods, and ancient beings. Finally, he came to the old sea god Nereus, a shapeshifter, ancient and wise. Heracles clung to the god as he changed form, a lion, a flame, a river, until Nereus relented and told him the way. At the edge of the world, Heracles found Atlas, the Titan condemned to hold up the sky on his shoulders for eternity. Knowing that the Hesperides were his daughters, Heracles struck a bargain. He would bear the weight of the heavens for a time, if Atlas retrieved the apples. Atlas, weary and eager for a reprieve, agreed. He walked into the garden, unhindered by Ladon, and returned with 3 of the golden apples in hand. But seeing Heracles struggling under the immense weight of the sky, Atlas had a second thought. He offered to take the apples to Eurystheus himself, leaving Heracles behind. But Heracles was not so easily tricked. Feigning agreement, he asked Atlas to briefly take back the burden so he could adjust his cloak. The Titan obliged, and in that moment, Heracles stepped away, apples in hand, and left Atlas to his eternal punishment. Heracles returned with the apples, radiant, fragrant, and humming with divine energy. Eurystheus accepted them in awe, but ultimately returned them to Athena, who brought them back to the garden where they belonged. 11 labors were now complete. Each had brought Heracles closer to redemption, but also deeper into the world's mysteries. He had crossed oceans, defied dragons, outwitted titans, and suffered betrayals. And still, one task remained, the most dangerous of all. The final labor would send Heracles beyond the mortal realm, to a place few dared even to speak of. The 12th labor, to descend into the underworld and bring back its guardian, the 3-headed hound, Cerberus. But that, my friend, is a story for the next time And now, we arrive at the final and most perilous of all 12 labors. A descent not into wilderness or war, but into the land of the dead itself. Heracles, having crossed deserts, slain beasts, and defied gods, was tasked with the impossible: to journey to the underworld and return with Cerberus, the monstrous 3-headed guardian of Hades' realm. This was a trial unlike any before. It was not about physical strength or strategic cunning alone. It was about confronting death, walking into a place from which no living man was meant to return. Even the mightiest warrior could not fight his way out of the underworld. It was a place of silence, of shadows, of souls that wandered in eternal stillness. And yet, Heracles accepted without hesitation. He traveled to Eleusis, a city sacred to Demeter and Persephone, to be purified in the rites of the Eleusinian mysteries, rituals meant to prepare the soul for encounters with the afterlife. Only after undergoing these secret ceremonies was Heracles granted permission to descend. To reach the underworld, he sought the cave at Cape Tainaron, one of the known entrances to Hades' realm. Before stepping inside, Heracles paused. The air was still, the earth was cold, and then he descended, torch in hand, past the point where sunlight dies. As he walked deeper, the warmth of the mortal world faded. The underworld was vast and layered, rivers of black water, fields of sorrow, and palaces of bone and obsidian. The river Styx flowed like a living shadow, watched over by the silent boatman, Charon. Heracles demanded passage, and at the sight of the lion skin and the gleaming club, Charon stepped aside without a word. Through the mists and caverns, Heracles passed countless shades, souls of the dead, whispering memories, some weeping, some still clutching at the dreams of life. Among them were heroes he had known. Theseus, still imprisoned in the underworld for attempting to kidnap Persephone. Heracles, moved by old friendship, freed him from his ghostly bonds. Eventually, Heracles arrived at the palace of Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the underworld. Hades, calm and unflinching, asked why a living man had dared to enter his domain. Heracles did not lie. He told the god plainly that he had been sent by Eurystheus to retrieve Cerberus. The Lord of the Dead considered the request, and to the surprise of many, agreed. But with one condition: Heracles must subdue Cerberus without weapons. Only his hands. No sword, no poisoned arrow, no divine tool. Just will against fury. And so Heracles descended further into the deepest chamber of the underworld, where Cerberus stood guard. The creature was unlike anything Heracles had faced, towering in size, with 3 snarling heads, a mane of snakes, and a serpent's tail that coiled and hissed with lethal intent. Its eyes burned with crimson fire, and its growls shook the ground. The moment Cerberus saw Heracles, it lunged. The battle was primal. Heracles ducked and twisted, avoiding fangs that could crush stone. He leapt on to the beast, wrapping his arms around its throats one after another, grappling it into submission. The snakes on its back bit and snapped at his skin, but Heracles held firm. For minutes that felt like hours, man and monster wrestled in the dark. Finally, with unmatched force and unrelenting will, Heracles pinned Cerberus. The beast snarled and thrashed but could not escape. He carried the subdued creature, heavy, furious yet bound, all the way back to the world of the living. When he emerged from the darkness, eyes blinking in daylight, even Eurystheus was struck speechless. The king had never truly believed Heracles would return. As expected, Eurystheus demanded the beast be sent back immediately. Heracles, respecting Hades' command, returned Cerberus unharmed to the underworld, fulfilling the final labor. 12 labors, each more daunting than the last. And yet Heracles had completed them all. But the story of Heracles does not end with the labors. In truth, they were merely one chapter of a life that would be defined by both divine destiny and mortal tragedy. After the final labor, Heracles sought a new path. He wandered again, seeking not just adventure, but purpose. Though he was now a figure of legend, his soul remained restless. He longed for peace, for forgiveness, and perhaps one day, for love that would not be lost to madness or divine cruelty. In time, Heracles married again, this time to Deianira, a woman of rare beauty and gentle heart. For a time, they lived happily. But as always, the shadow of Hera's curse loomed near. While traveling, the couple reached a river where a centaur named Nessus offered to carry Deianira across. But midway through, Nessus tried to abduct her. Heracles, from the far bank, drew his bow and shot the centaur with one of his poisoned arrows. Mortally wounded, Nessus devised a wicked revenge. He told Deianira, with his dying breath, that his blood could ensure Heracles' love would never fade. He claimed it was a love potion, when in truth, it was poisoned with the Hydra's venom, naive and desperate to keep her husband's affection. Deianira later smeared the blood onto a robe and gave it to Heracles. When Heracles put it on, the venom burned into his flesh. His skin blistered and blackened. No water could soothe the pain. No healer could help. The poison coursed through him like fire. In agony, Heracles climbed Mount Oeta. There he ordered a funeral pyre to be built. He knew his time in mortal form was at an end. As the flames rose around him, the pain became unbearable. But just as his mortal body was consumed, the skies opened. Zeus, watching from Olympus, intervened. A thunderbolt struck the pyre, and from the fire, Heracles ascended. His mortal shell burned away, but his divine soul rose upward. The hero was granted immortality. On Olympus, He was welcomed not as a son of shame, but as a god. The gods who once watched his trials in silence now stood to honor him. Even Hera, moved at last by his endurance, reconciled with him and gave him her daughter Hebe as his bride. And so Heracles, once a mortal born of betrayal, marked by tragedy, hounded by divine wrath, took his place among the stars. In the night sky, his constellation shines still, forever reminding us of strength that endures suffering, of greatness born from struggle, and of the delicate balance between man and God. His legend is not one of perfection, but perseverance, and that perhaps is why it has lasted for thousands of years. Though Heracles had ascended to the heavens, his story cast a long shadow across the mortal world. His legacy sparked countless tales, and among them rose new heroes, mortals touched by divinity, drawn into quests just as dangerous, just as transformative. The heroic age had begun, and with it, a generation of legends. Let us now journey to another myth, another figure whose name still echoes through time: Perseus, the slayer of Medusa. His tale begins not in battle, but in prophecy, with a king, a child, and the fear of fate. In the city of Argos lived King Acrisius, a ruler consumed by a singular fear that he would be overthrown by his own grandson. An oracle had spoken the prophecy, and Acrisius, desperate to avoid such a fate, took cruel action. His only daughter, Danae, was locked away in a bronze chamber, sealed from the world, from love, and from life. But no prison can hold out the gods. Zeus, gazing down from Olympus, saw Danae's sorrow, her beauty, her loneliness. In the form of golden light, he entered her chamber, a beam that shimmered through the cracks, cascading across her body. From that union, divine and surreal, Perseus was conceived. Acrisius, discovering the child, was both terrified and enraged. But he dared not kill his daughter or grandson outright, fearing the wrath of the gods. Instead, he placed them in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, believing fate could be drowned. But fate floats. Waves carried the chest across the ocean, and it came to rest on the island of Seriphos. There, a humble fisherman named Dictys discovered them and took them in. He raised Perseus as his own, teaching him the ways of the sea and shore. Danae, ever graceful, became beloved by all, save one, Polydectes, king of the island, and brother to Dictys. Polydectes desired Danae, but she refused him. In frustration, he plotted to remove Perseus, now a young man, brave and proud. Pretending to arrange a wedding, the king demanded that every man bring a gift. Perseus, poor but bold, boasted that he would bring something better than gold, the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turned all who looked upon her into stone. Polydectes laughed, the court laughed. But Perseus meant every word. He set off at once, though he had no idea where to begin. The Gorgons lived in a place no mortal knew, and to find them, Perseus first had to seek the Grey. 3 ancient sisters, older than the gods, who shared a single eye and a single tooth between them. Cloaked in mist and age, the Grey were difficult to find and even harder to persuade. But Perseus, sly and fast, snatched their eye mid-passing and refused to return it until they gave him the location of the Gorgons. Hissing and cursing, they relented. Still, finding Medusa was not enough. To face her and survive, Perseus needed divine gifts. Hermes, messenger of the gods, and Athena, ever the strategist, came to his aid. Hermes gave him a curved blade sharp enough to slice through scales and stone. Athena offered her polished shield, reflective and unyielding. The nymphs of the west gave him a cap of invisibility, winged sandals for flight, and a magical pouch to carry the Gorgon's head. Now armed, Perseus flew to the edge of the world, where the Gorgons slept among the ruins of an ancient temple. Of the 3 sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, only Medusa was mortal. Her once beautiful face was now a mask of terror, and her hair had been transformed into writhing serpents. But she was not born a monster. Medusa had once been a maiden of great beauty, a priestess of Athena. But when she was violated by Poseidon in the goddess's temple, Athena, in a fury that blurred justice with punishment, cursed her. Perseus approached quietly, using Athena's shield not to fight, but to see, watching Medusa's reflection instead of meeting her eyes. With care and speed, he crept closer, guided by the hiss of snakes and the rhythm of her breath. And then, one swift strike. The blade cut clean, and Medusa's head fell, eyes still glowing, deadly even in death. From her severed neck sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior, born of Poseidon's seed and divine magic. With a head secured in his pouch, Perseus took flight. But the other Gorgons awoke and gave chase, shrieking into the sky. Perseus, hidden by his helmet, escaped unseen, soaring high above their fury. On his return journey, the gods had one more twist for him. He came upon a kingdom by the sea, where a beautiful maiden was chained to a rock, waves crashing at her feet. Her name was Andromeda, and she was the daughter of Queen Cassiopeia, who had boasted that her beauty rivaled the sea nymphs. In punishment, Poseidon had sent a sea monster to ravage their coast. The oracle declared that only Andromeda's sacrifice would appease the god. As the monster rose from the deep, Perseus descended like a storm. He fought not with sword, but with sight. Unleashing Medusa's head, he turned the beast to stone. A new reef rising from the ocean floor, he freed Andromeda and claimed her as his bride. Together they returned to Seriphos. There Perseus found his mother still pursued by Polydectes. Enraged, he entered the palace and without a word revealed Medusa's head. The king and his courtiers turned to stone in an instant, silent statues of ambition and cruelty. Perseus restored Dictys to the throne, and then, fulfilling his arc, returned the divine gifts to the gods. Medusa's head he gave to Athena, who placed it at the center of her shield, a warning to all who would defy wisdom and justice. But the prophecy of Acrisius still loomed. In time, Perseus journeyed to Argos to reconcile with his grandfather. But Acrisius, upon hearing of his approach, fled in fear. Later, at an athletic contest, Perseus threw a discus, a sport he had mastered in youth. The discus, caught by a sudden gust of wind, struck a spectator and killed him. That man, as fate would cruelly reveal, was Acrisius. The prophecy had been fulfilled, not through malice but accident, and yet fate does not distinguish between the two. Stricken with guilt, Perseus refused the throne of Argos. Instead he exchanged kingdoms with another and founded the city of Mycenae, a place that would one day be ruled by his descendants, including Heracles himself. Thus the stories of gods and heroes intertwined again, threads crossing the vast tapestry of Greek myth. Perseus lived long and ruled wisely, and when his time came, Athena lifted him into the stars. His constellation glimmers above us even now, forever poised, sword raised, shielding the heavens from the dark. And so his tale ends, not with war or vengeance, but with legacy. From the heavens above to the oceans below, the Greek world teemed with heroes, monsters, and gods who played with fate like musicians with strings. Each tale was woven into the next, like stars stitched into the night sky. And now, from Perseus's triumph, we turn to another epic saga, the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts, a tale of brotherhood, betrayal, and the search for a golden prize. Long before Heracles labored, and even before the Trojan War cast its long shadow, there was Jason, a prince whose destiny was foretold by the rise and fall of kings. He was born in Iolcus, a kingdom ruled by King Aeson. But Aeson's brother, Peleus, seized the throne through deceit and treachery. Fearing for his infant son, Aeson smuggled Jason out of the city, hiding him in the care of the centaur Chiron, wise tutor of many heroes. Under Chiron's guidance, Jason grew strong in both body and mind. He learned the arts of war, music, healing, and philosophy. When he came of age, he set out to reclaim his rightful throne, unaware that the gods had already taken interest in his journey. As he neared Iolcus, Jason helped an old woman across a raging river. He carried her on his back, losing a sandal in the current. The old woman was, in truth, the goddess Hera, in disguise. Impressed by his kindness and humility, she pledged her support, a rare favor from the often unforgiving Queen of Olympus. Jason entered the city with 1 foot bare, and Peleus, upon seeing him, paled. An oracle had warned him to beware a man with 1 sandal. Feigning warmth, Peleus welcomed Jason, but asked, "What would you do, noble guest, if you were warned someone would one day overthrow you?" Jason replied without hesitation, "I would send him on a quest so dangerous he'd never return." Peleus smiled coldly. "Then go, brave Jason, and bring me the Golden Fleece." The Golden Fleece was more than a relic. It was a symbol of divine kingship, a magical hide from a winged ram sent by the gods to save the children of Nephili. The ram had flown them to Colchis, a kingdom at the far edge of the known world, where its fleece was hung in a sacred grove, guarded by fire-breathing bulls and an ever-watchful dragon. Jason accepted the challenge and began assembling a crew of the greatest heroes Greece had to offer. Among them were Heracles, Orpheus the musician, Castor, and Pollux the twin warriors, Atalanta the huntress, and many others, each a legend in their own right. Together, they became known as the Argonauts, named for their ship, the Argo. Crafted by the master builder Argus and blessed by Athena herself. Their journey was long and perilous. They sailed past the cliffs of Thessaly and into the treacherous seas. At Lemnos, they encountered an island of women who had slain their unfaithful husbands. There Jason and his men stayed for a time, their mission nearly forgotten in the arms of lonely queens. But duty called, and the Argo sailed once more. They braved the land of the Bebryces, where King Amycus challenged strangers to deadly boxing matches. Pollux, with fists like thunder, defeated the tyrant, and the Argonauts continued on. In Thrace, they met the blind prophet Phineus, tormented by the Harpies, winged creatures that stole his food and fouled what remained. The Argonauts drove them away, and in gratitude, Phineus warned them of the Symplegades, clashing rocks that crushed ships to splinters. He instructed them to release a dove first. If it passed safely, they should row with all their might. They followed his advice. The dove slipped through, losing only a single feather. The Argonauts rowed with desperate speed, the rocks grinding and shuddering behind them. By a hair's breadth, they escaped, and the path to Colchis lay open. When they arrived, King Aeetes, guardian of the fleece, greeted them with suspicion. He agreed to give them the prize, but only if Jason completed 3 impossible tasks. First, he must yoke 2 fire-breathing bulls and plow a field with them. Second, he must sow the field with dragon's teeth, from which armed warriors would spring from the earth. Third, he must defeat those warriors and survive until dawn. Jason was brave, but no match for these challenges alone. Fortunately, the gods had moved again. Eros, at Hera's bidding, struck Aeetes' daughter, Medea, with an arrow of love. Medea, a sorceress of unmatched power, fell for Jason at once. She promised to help him, not for glory or reward, but for love. She gave him an ointment to protect him from flame, told him how to defeat the Earthborn warriors by sowing discord among them, and whispered ancient spells that would lull the dragon to sleep. Jason completed each task flawlessly, and yet Aeetes betrayed him. Refusing to give up the fleece, he planned to kill Jason and the Argonauts in the night. Warned by Medea, Jason stole the fleece under moonlight, its golden glow lighting the grove, and fled with her aboard the Argo. But the king gave chase. To delay her father, Medea committed an act that would stain her legend forever. She killed her own brother, Absyrtus, and scattered his limbs in the sea. Aeetes, horrified, stopped to gather his son's remains, allowing the Argonauts to escape. The journey home was no easier. They sailed past the island of the Sirens, whose songs drove men mad. Only Orpheus, playing his lyre louder than their seductive voices, kept the crew safe. They passed Scylla and Charybdis, the twin sea monsters, and finally reached home, weathered, wiser, and forever changed. But Jason's trials were not over. Back in Iolcus, he discovered that Peleus had murdered his father. In a cruel twist, Medea used her magic to convince Peleus's daughters to kill him, tricking them into thinking they could restore his youth by boiling him in a cauldron of herbs. With Peleus dead, Jason handed the kingdom to a rightful heir and fled with Medea to Corinth. There they lived peacefully for a time. They had children, they built a home. But Jason, ever restless, grew distant. He sought power once more and arranged to marry the princess of Corinth. Betrayed and broken, Medea unleashed her wrath. She sent the princess a poisoned robe, which burst into flames and consumed her and her father, the king. And in her most infamous act, she took the lives of her own children. Not out of hatred, but to wound Jason in a way that would never heal. When he arrived, she stood over the bodies, defiant and shattered. Then she vanished in a chariot drawn by dragons, leaving Jason to grieve not just loss, but the ruin of his soul. He spent the rest of his days wandering, a hero without purpose. In the end, he returned to the Argo, now decayed and abandoned. Sitting beneath its hull, he was struck by a falling beam and killed. A quiet, ignoble death for a man who once sailed with gods. But the tale of the Argonauts endured. It reminded mortals that glory and tragedy were never far apart. That the gods gave gifts wrapped in curses, and that love, when entangled with ambition, could burn brighter and darker than any star. As the Argonaut sails faded into myth, and Jason's sorrow echoed across time, another story rose like a storm cloud on the horizon. A tale forged in pride, conflict, and destiny. This was the story of a city that burned, of a war that raged for 10 years, and of heroes whose names would be etched into eternity. The tale of Troy. It all began not with a sword, but with a wedding, a celebration that would unleash chaos across gods and mortals alike. When Peleus, a mortal king, wed Thetis, a sea nymph of divine beauty, all the gods were invited to the grand feast on Mount Olympus, all except one, Eris, goddess of discord. Angered by the exclusion, Eris crashed the celebration and tossed into the crowd a golden apple inscribed with 3 words, "To the fairest." It was a trap, and the gods fell into it. Hera, queen of Olympus, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love. Each claimed the apple. To settle the dispute, they turned to Zeus, but he wisely refused to choose. Instead, he sent them to a mortal shepherd named Paris, prince of Troy, who lived in hiding on Mount Ida. Each goddess attempted to sway Paris with divine bribes. Hera offered power, kingship over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and unmatched skill in battle. Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose love. He gave the apple to Aphrodite, sealing his fate and the fate of Troy. For the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta, wife of King Menelaus. With Aphrodite's aid, Paris traveled to Sparta, where he was welcomed as a guest. But under the guise of diplomacy, he seduced Helen. Whether she went willingly or was bewitched depends on the version, but in all, she left with Paris, sailing to Troy. Menelaus was humiliated, but he was not alone. His brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, saw an opportunity, not just for revenge, but for glory. He called upon the oath that bound the Greek kings, that they would all defend Helen's marriage, a pact forged long ago to avoid conflict, now used to ignite it. The greatest warriors of Greece answered the call. Odysseus, clever and reluctant. Achilles, young and invincible. Ajax, mighty and fearless. Nestor, wise and battle-hardened. 1,000 ships set sail for Troy. A city thought unconquerable, built with the help of the gods themselves. The war lasted 10 long years. In the beginning, the Greeks believed it would be a swift victory. But Troy was defended by Hector, noble prince and unmatched warrior, and by the city's walls, built by Poseidon and Apollo. The gods, too, chose sides. Hera and Athena favored the Greeks, still bitter over the apple. Aphrodite and Apollo defended Troy, bound by love and loyalty. Achilles became the Greeks' greatest weapon, swift of foot, deadly in combat, and nearly invulnerable. His only weakness, it was said, was his heel. But he was also proud, and when Agamemnon insulted him by taking a captive girl he loved, Achilles withdrew from battle. With Achilles gone, the tide turned. Hector led a fierce assault and drove the Greeks back to their ships. Desperate, the Greeks begged Achilles to return. He refused until tragedy struck. Patroclus, his closest companion, brother in arms, perhaps in heart, donned Achilles' armor and went into battle. He fought valiantly, but was slain by Hector. When Achilles learned of his death, his grief became rage. He returned to battle, cutting through Trojan ranks like a storm. He faced Hector in single combat, and the duel was brutal. In the end, Achilles struck Hector down, and in his fury, tied the body to his chariot, dragging it around the walls of Troy. It was a moment of dishonor, and even the gods wept. Eventually, Priam, the aged king of Troy and Hector's father, came in disguise to the Greek camp. He knelt before Achilles, kissed his hands, and begged for his son's body. Achilles, moved by the king's humility and pain, relented. For a brief moment, the war paused. But not for long. Achilles' fate, too, was sealed. Guided by Apollo, Paris shot an arrow that struck his heel. The one vulnerable point left unprotected. Achilles died, and the Greeks mourned. Still, Troy did not fall. So Odysseus, the master of cunning, devised a final plan. They would pretend to retreat. In their place, they left a massive wooden horse, a gift for the Trojans. Hidden inside were warriors. The Trojans, believing the war had ended, brought the horse into the city as a trophy. That night, as the city slept, the Greeks emerged. They opened the gates and the army returned. Troy, once proud and mighty, burned. Priam was slain. Hector's young son was thrown from the walls. The women were taken as slaves. Only Aeneas, carrying his father on his back, escaped. A remnant of Troy's legacy, bound for a new world. The Greeks, though victorious, paid dearly. Their journey home was fraught with trials. Odysseus wandered for 10 years. Agamemnon returned to betrayal and death. The gods, displeased by the cruelty shown, scattered the victors like dust in the wind. And Helen? She returned to Sparta with Menelaus, her face still as beautiful, her name forever cursed. Some say she was guiltless, others that she was the flame that consumed 1,000 ships. The War of Troy became legend not because of who won, but because of what it cost. The greatest of men, the wrath of gods, and the shattering of glory. And in that ruin, a new world began to rise. One shaped by the survivors, the exiles, and those who dared to dream beyond the ashes. A fire that consumed Troy gave rise not just to ashes, but to new legends, stories born in the silence after war, where loss and longing shaped heroes more than glory ever could. And among those tales, none is as winding, as bittersweet, or as human as that of Odysseus. The clever king of Ithaca, the reluctant warrior, and the weary traveler who took 10 years not to fight a war, but to come home from one. Odysseus had never wanted to go to Troy. When summoned to honor the oath to protect Helen's marriage, he pretended madness, yoking an ox and a donkey to a plow, and sowing salt into his fields. But the ruse was uncovered when the messenger placed his infant son, Telemachus, in the furrows. Odysseus swerved to avoid him, revealing his sanity and sealing his fate. For 10 years he fought alongside the Greeks, not as the strongest or the swiftest, but as the sharpest mind among them. He was the one who devised the Trojan horse, the trick that ended a decade of war. But it was that same mind, proud and cunning, that angered the gods. As the Greeks set sail for home, Odysseus's ship was swept off course. Thus began his odyssey, a journey across storm-tossed seas, where myth and danger lurked behind every wave. First came the land of the Cicones, where his men, drunk with victory, looted and delayed. The Cicones retaliated, and many Greeks fell. From there, storms blew them to the land of the Lotus Eaters, a place where memory faded and time stood still. The locals offered lotus flowers, sweet and narcotic, Those who ate them forgot their homes, their purpose. Odysseus had to drag his men away by force. Then came the island of the Cyclopes, lawless giants with a taste for flesh. They entered the cave of Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, who trapped them and began devouring them one by one. Odysseus, ever resourceful, offered the monster wine, getting him drunk. He told him his name was Nobody. Then while the Cyclops slept, they drove a sharpened stake into his eye. When Polyphemus screamed, the other Cyclopes came and asked who was hurting him. Nobody, he bellowed. So they left. But Odysseus, prideful, revealed his true name as they fled. A fatal mistake. Polyphemus prayed to his father, and Poseidon, god of the sea, became Odysseus's greatest enemy. Driven onward by storms and spite, Odysseus reached Aeolia, where the wind god gave him a bag containing every wind, all but the west, which would blow him home. His crew, suspecting treasure, opened it. The winds escaped, and the ship was flung far off course. They came next to the land of the Laestrygonians, cannibal giants who destroyed all ships but Odysseus's own. Weary and dwindling, they reached Aiaia, island of the sorceress Circe. She turned his men into pigs, but Hermes gave Odysseus a magical herb to resist her spells. He confronted her, and she restored his men. They stayed for a year, feasting and forgetting. But eventually, Circe warned Odysseus. To reach home, he must journey to the underworld and speak to the prophet Tiresias. There, among shades and shadows, Odysseus saw the spirits of his mother, of fallen comrades, and of heroes past. Tiresias told him that his journey home would be long and hard, and that even then, peace would not come easily. Returning to the world above, Odysseus continued on, now carrying the weight of death on his back. Next came the Sirens, whose songs lured sailors to their doom. Odysseus, curious to hear them, had his men plug their ears and lash him to the mast. As they sailed past, the music pierced his soul. Promises of knowledge, beauty, and rest. But he endured. Then came Scylla and Charybdis, two monsters guarding a narrow strait. Scylla was a six-headed beast who snatched men from ships. Charybdis was a whirlpool that devoured the sea. Odysseus steered toward Scylla, losing 6 men but sparing the ship. Finally they reached Thrinacia, where sacred cattle of the sun god grazed. Though warned not to touch them, his starving crew slaughtered the beasts. As punishment, Zeus struck the ship with lightning, all but Odysseus perished. He washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, where the nymph Calypso found him. She loved him and kept him for 7 years, offering immortality if he would stay. But Odysseus, though tempted, longed only for home. The gods intervened. Hermes commanded Calypso to let him go. She wept, but obeyed. Odysseus built a raft and set out again, only for Poseidon to send another storm. He was saved by the sea goddess Leucothea and floated to the land of the Phaeacians. There, battered and broken, he told his tale. Moved by his journey, the Phaeacians gave him a ship at last. And so after 20 years, Odysseus returned to Ithaca. But his trials were not over. At home, suitors had invaded his hall, feasting on his wealth and courting his wife, Penelope. She had held them off with wit and faith, weaving a shroud by day and unraveling it by night. But now, the time had come. Disguised as a beggar, Odysseus entered his home. He saw the ruin of his legacy, the arrogance of the men who thought him dead. With the help of his son, Telemachus, and a few loyal servants, he revealed himself. He strung his great bow, a feat no man could match, and unleashed his fury. Arrows flew, the suitors fell. Ithaca was his again. Penelope, ever cautious, tested him, asking about their bed, built from a living tree. Odysseus answered perfectly, and at last, husband and wife were reunited. There was peace for a time, but even in old age, prophecy haunted him. Tiresias had spoken of one final journey, a journey inland, where men knew not the sea. There, Odysseus would plant his oar and make peace with the gods. And so he set out once more, quietly, humbly. A hero not of conquest, but of endurance. His life, like his voyage, was not about reaching the shore, but surviving the storm. The great tales of Greek mythology, of Heracles and Perseus, Jason and Odysseus, are not just stories of strength and triumph. They are mirrors, reflections of the human spirit at its most defiant, its most vulnerable, its most divine. As the fires of war die down and the heroes fade into legend, we are left with questions that echo louder than any clash of sword or thunder of God. What does it mean to be remembered? Some say it's to conquer, to rise above all others and leave your name written in stone. Others say it is to endure, to fall, to rise again, and to keep walking even when the path vanishes beneath your feet. And some, like Aeneas, the last great figure in our journey, are remembered not for what they destroyed, but for what they built. When Troy fell in fire and ash, Aeneas did not seek vengeance. He did not look back. Carrying his aged father Anchises on his shoulders, guiding his young son Ascanius by the hand, and mourning the loss of his wife Creusa, Aeneas walked out of a burning city, carrying the future in his arms. The gods had spared him for a reason. Venus, his mother, whispered of a new destiny. Jupiter, king of the gods, had ordained that from Aeneas would spring a people, a new city, a new empire, one that would endure for ages. So he sailed, not for glory, but for survival. His journey was long and troubled, echoing that of Odysseus. He faced storms sent by Juno, queen of the gods, who despised the Trojans. He landed in Carthage, where Queen Dido welcomed him with open arms and fell hopelessly in love. For a time, Aeneas stayed. He helped build her city. He shared her bed. But when Mercury came bearing the will of Jupiter, Aeneas knew he could not remain. His purpose was elsewhere. He left in the night, and Dido, betrayed and broken, climbed a pyre and cursed his descendants before taking her own life. Her curse would echo across time, for Carthage and Rome would one day clash in wars that shook the world. But Aeneas pressed on. He reached Sicily, where he buried his father. He journeyed to the Italian shores, where prophecy and war awaited, and like Odysseus, he too had to descend into the underworld. There, guided by the Sibyl, he walked among the dead, seeing not only the shades of the past, but the future. He saw the souls of great Romans yet to be born, kings, senators, generals. He saw Augustus, the first emperor, in radiant glory, and he understood his suffering was not in vain. He was a bridge between worlds, a seed from which an empire would rise. When he returned, Aeneas found Italy divided. The Latins welcomed him, and King Latinus offered him his daughter Lavinia in marriage. But Turnus, her former suitor and leader of the Rutulians, declared war. The battles were fierce, and blood once again stained the earth. Aeneas fought not for pride, but for peace. Yet fate demanded conflict. And when Turnus killed Aeneas's friend Pallas, son of an ally, destiny hardened into vengeance. In the final duel, Aeneas defeated Turnus. As the fallen warrior begged for mercy, Aeneas hesitated. Then, seeing Pallas's belt on Turnus's waist, he drove his sword through the man's heart. The war ended, and Aeneas fulfilled his destiny. He married Lavinia, founded a new line of kings, and laid the foundations of what would become Rome, a city that would rule the known world for centuries. Aeneas' story reminds us that legacy is not forged in conquest alone. It is built in sacrifice, in sorrow, in the quiet determination to keep going when all else is lost. He was not the strongest, nor the cleverest, nor the most beloved, but he carried a flame, and he kept it alive. As we leave the world of Greek mythology, we do not leave behind gods or monsters, heroes or oracles. We carry with us what they represented: courage in the face of impossible odds, loyalty that defies logic, love that scars and heals in equal measure. These stories are not just relics. They are living myths, reborn every time we ask ourselves how to be brave, how to forgive, how to endure. Look to the sky, and you'll see constellations that once bore the names of these heroes. Look into your own struggle, and you might see a spark of them in yourself. We all have our labors to bear, our wars to fight, our homes to return to. And perhaps that is the greatest truth mythology ever offered. That the journey never ends, and the hero is always you.